This is theBreaker.news podcast for the week of January 7th, 2024. I'm Bob Mackin, publisher of theBreaker.news and host of theBreaker.news podcast. Welcome to edition number 324, the first edition of 2024. The Breaker is your source for news, opinion, and analysis about British Columbia issues, institutions, and influencers. Later, I'll tell you how you can support The Breaker. On this edition, headlines from the Pacific Rim and the Pacific Northwest. I award a virtual Nanaimo bar to a difference maker. And on the Big Deal feature, what's next for Wall Street and what's next for Main Street? Economy and geopolitics near and far. I welcome back Glenn Ross, the supply chain expert with ACC Group in Surrey, British Columbia, to make sense of the international conflict and domestic inflation. This is the Big Deal feature on the Breaker.news podcast. Welcome to the first Big Deal feature on the first edition of the podcast recorded in 2024. What's next for Wall Street? What's next for Main Street? What's next in the world economy and geopolitics for us all? I welcome back Glenn Ross, a supply chain expert with ACC Group in Surrey, British Columbia, to help me answer those questions. We start 2024 with two wars on the heels of the worst pandemic in more than a century and fears that a third war is around the corner. First, I'm speaking about Russia's war on Ukraine that began in early 2022, and also Israel's war on Hamas after last October 7th massacre by the Palestinian terrorist group, the deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust. Meanwhile, China continues to threaten to invade Taiwan, the self-governing democratic island where a new president will be elected on January 13th. And that brings me to my first question for Glenn Ross about China becoming the largest auto exporter in the world. Chinese industry has increased at a time that the Chinese economy has not. We've seen problems in the Chinese real estate industry, but China has drawn closer to Russia since 2022 when Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin held their pre-Olympic summit. And China is actually indirectly helping Russia's war effort. And I wonder if you can explain that, Glenn, how China is helping keep Russia alive.
Well, there's a couple of things. One is they're both part of BRICS, and BRICS is led by China to all intents and measures, although I do believe that they're using South Africa as the snapper dog in front. Now, I come from South Africa, so I'm keenly aware of that. And you've seen the latest application on the ICJ against Israel is South Africa fronting for them, so they can always say, plausible deniability now is that South Africa is not us, but it's all part of BRICS. So BRICS, China has the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, which has been going for many years. It's had a couple of stops and starts, not the least of which is some of the donor countries that are receiving money from China can't pay them back, and that's just because they didn't plan it properly. But having said that, so it doesn't pay for China to see anything happen to Russia. Russia's an instrumental part of the Chinese way forward for two reasons primarily. One is the technology side, and the other, of course, is the energy side. China gets a lot of its oil and stuff from Russia. The EU is moving its natural gas purchases away from Russia, but they can't switch from west to east because there isn't sufficient capacity in the pipelines. They've got a major pipeline, they're building the second one, and of course, that's not going to be sufficient, which means that China is still largely dependent on the Middle East for its oil supplies, particularly through the Straits of Hormuz. And that's where BRICS comes into play because, as we spoke about before we went on this podcast, Bob, Iran is going to be joining BRICS. Argentina is now opted out. Saudi Arabia is going to be joining, and there's 4 or 5 guys going to join now. But the Global South is sitting on the fence. And the Global South is the future. That's where the markets are. That's where the raw and strategic materials are located. And China and Russia have been in there for decades. So going back to the oil and energy, 17% of the world's oil supplies flows through the Straits of Hormuz. And of course, Iran is right there. And you have the Red Sea just a little bit south. You have the Houthis from Yemen in there. So it's not a good situation at all because I'm sure behind the scenes, China is saying to Iran, don't do anything precipitous in the Straits of Hormuz because we depend on that oil supply, as is the supply coming through from Iran. So China needs to make sure that Russia doesn't collapse. So China's been what I would call the banker for Russia, which has allowed them to more or less keep going and manufacturing arms and ammunition, etc. The Russian economy is not anything close to where it should be. China needs Russia to finish this war so it can get on with its BRICS and a second bipolar world new order. It has to get that going, because by 2049 is the 100th year anniversary of the 1949 Mao Zedong March. And it doesn't look like they're going to achieve what they want to there. Hidden in the background is the census that was held in 2020 in China, and they overstated their population by some 140 million citizens. That is catastrophic, because if you look at the demographic profiles, the demographic growth, most of that 140 million in China are results of the one-child policy, but are under 40 years old and women of childbearing age, which is catastrophic for the demographic curve in China. It actually means that by 2050, China's population will drop to around about 800 million, 750 million citizens. That is just unbelievable. So they need the Russian economy to go in. They need to get this thing with BRICS going into a bipolar world order quicker than before. And things aren't looking good for them.
That leads me to the Taiwan question. The people of Taiwan will have their say January 13th on who they want as their new president, and of course their new legislature. So it's not over for Taiwan, but of course we can see what Xi Jinping wants to do with Taiwan.
Well, you need to look at this thing in a broader context. America has what's called the first island policy, where they can literally shut China down in 24 hours. And that runs from South Korea all the way down to the Malacca Straits. And they have submarine patrols, they have electronic patrols, they have battle cruiser groups all over the place. But herein lies the thing. There's 2 points I'd like to make here. The first one is, I don't believe China's going to go into Taiwan. There's 100 nautical miles between them. They have to move between 600 and 800,000 soldiers across that Taiwan Strait to get into Taiwan. And then they have to go to the southern part of Taiwan, where the only landing parts. The rest of Taiwan's like a long mountain range that came out of the sea. It's only in the southwest where you can literally land. You can't land on the western side because the beaches are literally 1.5 kilometers wide, so you can't land. Now, between 600 and 800,000 soldiers or combatants coming across the Taiwan Straits now means they have to transfer from troop carriers to landing craft in order to beach. They can't do that. And all the satellite imagery shows no construction of landing craft at all in China. So it looks like it's going to be a physical impossibility. Once they land in Taiwan, China then has to administer it. And that's going to take over 2 million administrators in a country that has a big mountain range running north to south, which is ideal for, as Mao Zedong's Great March in 1947 and 1949 was. You can't get them. So put that aside. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, which was supposed to be in a 3-day sojourn, Putin even had a standby cabinet in place to install in Kiev, and that didn't happen. And nearly 2 years later, it's now day 681 from then. Russia's lost 358,000 soldiers killed. Now that has been an eye-opener for China, because Russia's linked by land to Ukraine, whereas China's not linked by land to Taiwan. So this is an exercise of futility and impossibility. Physically, they just can't do it. And if they do land in the southwest of Taiwan, that's where all the chip manufacturers are located. They're all going to get destroyed. So I don't see that happening. I don't see them not trying to force and coerce some type of closer self-governing autonomous province over there. But I don't see them physically going in there. I just can't see that happening, Bob.
You mentioned earlier about the situation regarding the Iran-backed Houthi militants who are making things difficult for the world shipping industry, that are forcing shipping companies to take the long way around Africa to get goods to market, to get resources to market, or to pick them up from ports and take them to market. That, of course, is going to add extra costs. That is going to add extra pollution to the environment. As long as this happens, even though there are American warships and other allies, Canada's involved in an operation to try to secure the shipping routes. But this all stems from the support for the the Palestinian territory since the October 7th massacre and Israel's move to defend itself. Where is this going to go in 24?
Well, you need to look at both sides of the coin here. One is, yes, Israel is in there, and I have a whole different theory about that. But this, to me, is going to be the precipitator of the second, what we call the bipolar world order, which China's been sitting nicely on the fence and watching. I don't think China needs to go into Taiwan to realize its ambitions. It's got the global south where the future of the world lies, not only in the, as I said earlier, the strategic and raw minerals and materials, but two major factors come into play. One is the source of labor, which has gone from China, is now going into South America. From there, it'll migrate across the Atlantic into Africa. And the future market. That's where the growth is. That's where the per capita expenditure is going to grow. So the West is slowly but surely is precipitating a divide between itself and the global south. And yesterday, 20 countries have opted to opt out of the dollar exchange. So that's not good from that perspective. But going back to your question, the Houthis are a Shia group in Yemen. They de facto control that part of Yemen. So Russia ran into Ukraine, and the second largest army in the world was stopped dead in its tracks. Israel is going into Gaza, and it's been stopped dead in its tracks. They are suffering far more casualties than they're actually publicly proclaiming. Haaretz, the biggest newspaper in Israel, estimates that there's over 3,500 Israelis being killed, and that all the hospitals are overflowing with Israeli casualties. But the IDF is not disclosing that. So what I'm saying, in essence, that all the big players, the strong armies, are being stopped in their tracks. And the smaller players are watching this, none the least of which is the Houthis. So the Houthis are out in the Red Sea. They've got thousands and thousands of rockets and limpet mines and all sorts of stuff. 1945 to 1955, America took over the oceans of the world and created the fertile area for globalization, which has seen the whole world grow and grow and grow. And now they're stepping back from that. And the Houthis and these smaller groupings, and they'll be the first of many to come, Bob, are stepping up and saying, you know what, we support the Palestinians in Gaza. And so do a lot of Arab states. And Arab states are balanced very precipitously right now because their people, their citizens are saying, go in there and stop Israel. We haven't seen the outfall of that yet. 96% of Saudi citizens have said they don't believe the royal family is doing enough to help the Arabs in Gaza. So there's something going on that's going to blow in the next 6 to 8 months. But the Houthis, in the meantime, are stopping Israeli-bound ships coming through the Red Sea. Not entirely, but certainly effectively, which means they now have to go around the Cape of Good Hope. And you couple that with the Panama Canal, which has a problem with water. So 2 of your 5 main straits in the world where traffic flows through are now under threat. The other one, of course, is up in the Straits of Hormuz, I mentioned earlier, with Iran on that border. So things are balanced precipitously, which is going to impact inflation, trades, goods, price of goods, as well as the shipping industry around the world. It's going to have an effect comparable to COVID-19 a couple of 3 years ago. So it's not a good situation. The Americans have moved from controlling the oceans of the world with a whole lot of destroyers all over the world where they could react in very quick fashion to carrier-based groups which are monolithic, slow, and now being exposed to the juggernauts they are. And I think it's going to, what you may want to expect to see in the next year to 2 years is an American aircraft carrier being sunk. They're big, they're huge, but the world of armaments and warfare is changing in front of our eyes. Ukraine has shown the soft underbelly of the second largest army in the world. The Palestinians, or the Hamas down in Israel, is stopping the Israeli tanks. Apparently they've lost up to 800 armored vehicles in southern Gaza. This is why they pulled the 8 battalions out the last 3 days. And this is something else brewing away, which I don't think we're part of this particular broadcast is about, Bob, but there's something going on. And the Houthis are but one symptom of what's going to go down in the next 6 to 8 months.
Do you think that the United States could become a microchip giant on the scale that it became a major oil and gas player after 9/11? After 9/11, the terrorist attacks, that really was the catalyst for the United States to say, hey, we've got to produce our own oil and gas. And guess what? They found a lot of it. And they became self-sufficient in many ways in oil and gas. Do you think that the same is happening in microchips, that the United States will become so dominant in microchips that it will put other countries, maybe the Chinese, on their heels?
Well, again, everything is multidimensional. So the US used to be the big guy in this particular field, and now it's down to about 12 to 15% of world supply. But all the chips are made with US technology, made in South Korea and made in Taiwan. Now, there's three different levels of chips, depending on what you want to do. If you want to go and buy yourself a transistor radio, you use the bottom level. If you want to go and buy yourself a medical device, you use the top level, the middle level. And if you want to build a nuclear weapon, you go and use the top level. So there are things called fabs, FABs. Those are the fabrication centers. Not anybody can get into making microchips. TSMC is the largest chip manufacturer in the world, and they're based in Taiwan. Now, it takes about $3 to $4 billion to establish a fab. Now, in Taiwan, they've done that with governmental assistance, and China's doing that. And China's tried to get into this market, and it took a lot of military generals and put them in charge, and they know nothing about chips, and it all fell over, which is what makes Taiwan so attractive, and which is why they don't want to go into Taiwan and destroy the fabs, because then it's all for naught. So to answer your question, TSMC is now establishing a big microchip factory in Arizona, two of them in Arizona, one in Pennsylvania. They're looking at one down in the Carolinas. But in America, the bi-party system works to its benefit and it works to its destruction, not the least of which is their supply chain system. But this is all going to have to be privately funded. Now, every 2 years, Moore's law kicks in. The technology doubles in 2 years. So that means the money you sink into a fab production facility in in Phoenix, Arizona, every 2 years you've got to sink as much money in again, if not as much, but certainly close to it, to keep abreast with technological development. Now, we're currently sitting at level 5 on the upper level of microchips. Level 6 is on the board. That's going to cost $8 billion to develop, and that's in the hands of the Taiwanese, TSMC. South Korea is still running around the level 3 and level 4 levels. So it's going to take hundreds of billions of dollars, and the American government doesn't have that. The problem, Bob, is that to get to realize this thing in America, to get them to be up there, it's going to take private capital. And the private guys rather go invest in electric motor vehicles than they will on chips, because it's going to keep requiring investments every 2 to 5 years, hundreds of billions of dollars to keep abreast of the developmental cycle. And the American government hasn't got the money. Private industry in America doesn't want to go near it because there's no return for them. So it's a catch-22 situation from America's perspective. Strategically, they're going to have to throw money like Eisenhower did at the interstate system in 1959. They're going to have to throw in $100 to $200 billion, and even then, there's no guarantee of it happening. So America's certainly going to, not for want of trying, they're going to try and get in there to be self-dependent from a strategic perspective, unless the government mandates, which I can't see happening. Private industry is not going to rush into this industry. It's just not going to do it. They're going to make a lot more money by going into Ukraine and funding Ukraine's armaments systems in Ukraine. And don't forget, Ukraine used to be the biggest armaments base for the Soviet Union. They made the biggest tank factory in the world was in Kharkiv before Russia blew it up in the second week of the war. Stupid, but that's what they did. So a lot of American and Western countries are looking to go into Taiwan, not into chips, to go and participate in it's not Taiwan, sorry, I mean Ukraine, to go into Ukraine and help them build an armaments industry. And they're going to make billions out of that. But chips, nah, it's not a good return.
And finally, 2024 is a U.S. presidential year. Joe Biden is up for re-election. Of course, Donald Trump wants to get back into the White House. Still many weeks and many months until Election Day. Many things can happen. Surprises can happen along the way. 2024 could be an election year in Canada. 2025 is the scheduled election, as Justin Trudeau says he plans to remain as Liberal leader and Prime Minister. He could always go early in 2024 and call an election as well. But one thing that will be affecting politics on either side of the 49th parallel is inflation. It seems to be slowing down in the United States, not so much in Canada. Where is the economy going for people on Main Street in Canada and the US in this 2024 year when inflation still is a concern?
It always comes down to domestic expenditure. It always comes down to how much money's in my pocket. That's what it does. That's what affects everybody. We can pontificate and people can talk about all sorts of stuff in politics, but until it resonates in somebody's pocket, they have a very short attention span. America's down to 2.9%. It's the lowest it's been in many, many years. But this thing with the Houthis and with the Panama Canal, and we shot one more straight and inflation goes through the roof once more. Because all those ships have got to go take longer routes all the way around. So they go from a 14-day cruise to a 26-day cruise. That means more containers are stuck on ship decks and aren't on where they should be out in the streets. We still haven't got over the container shortage from COVID-19. So it's not a good situation. I see inflation going up and higher. I see it certainly going higher and higher in Canada. What we've done with globalization is taken the supply of food all over the place. I mean, you look at Israel. Israel's food baskets in the northern part, just south of the Lebanese border. They've evacuated 97,000 people out of there, mostly farmers. That's their farming belt. So now Israel has to find food from somewhere else. That applies to a lot of countries around the world. So yeah, we have some self-subsistence, but more importantly, inflation is going to go higher and higher, as is the shortage. But the biggest thing going to be fighting us in the next couple of 5, 6, 10 years is water. Never mind beach sand, which is the basis of the glass industry, is water. There are going to be more and more water wars, around the world. But to answer your question, I don't see it going well. I see Biden struggling because the vast majority of young Americans are anti his position on Israel and Gaza. They side with the Palestinians, overwhelmingly so. The Palestinian American population, mainly centered around Michigan and Wisconsin, has openly stated they're not going to vote for him, and those are both swing states. So I can see Biden and the Democrats doing taking some very extraordinary measures in the next 3 to 6 months. You can't do it close to the election because it's too late by that time. People have decided. But certainly I can see things changing. So these wars, Bob, your opening question, are changing our world in more ways than one. And in some ways it's welcome that we can see the millennials come through. The boomers are going into retirement, which is a huge problem from a demographic perspective. And the spending patterns are changing before our eyes at a faster rate than we've seen in 150 years. So the world is changing. And sitting on the sidelines out there is BRICS, just waiting and watching for the right moment to step in and say, right, yeah, we have a bipolar world order, which changes everything.
Yeah, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, along with new supporting cast, Saudi Arabia and Iran. It's going to be a very interesting year, a year of a lot of nerves, a lot of people wondering what is next around the corner, again, for Main Street as well as Wall Street. We thank you for coming on the podcast to lay it all out there, as you always do so eloquently, to explain what is going on from a geopolitical standpoint, economic standpoint, conflict standpoint. Glenn Ross, supply chain expert with ACC Group in Surrey, British Columbia.
It's time on the theBreaker.news podcast for Around the Rim. We look at news headlines around the Pacific Rim. In the Hong Kong Free Press, Taiwan presidential frontrunner Lai Chang-te says island will resist China's attempts to influence election. Dubbed a troublemaker and a separatist by Beijing, Lai is up against 2 other candidates who have pledged closer relations with China if elected. Quote, "Everyone cherishes Taiwan's democracy. I have confidence that the people will resist China's use of various forces to try to influence this election," he said. Taiwan's January 13th election is being closely watched by policymakers from Beijing to Washington, as its outcome could reshape future relations with an increasingly bellicose China. In the Taiwan news, quirky campaign promises steal spotlight as Taiwan gears up for elections. Unconventional political platforms emerge ahead of the January 13th vote. The presidency and a total of 113 seats are up for grabs, and some independent candidates or candidates from smaller parties with dim prospects of being elected are attracting attention with their bizarre and certainly not serious policies. One candidate proposes healthy, smart, and beautiful youths from around the world to mate with Taiwanese for the reproduction of premium offspring. Another vows to ban taros in hot pot dishes and mixing rice with curry sauce. In Kyoto news, U.S. to provide Japan quake support, including through military. Japan has accepted a U.S. offer to assist in response to the powerful quake that rocked the central region on New Year's Day, U.S. Ambassador to Japan Rahm Emanuel said Thursday, noting that logistical support from the military as well as food and other supplies are being readied. Initially, the U.S. aid will be worth around $100,000, but that would be a down payment, Emanuel said. That's Around the Rim on this edition of the Breaker.news podcast. Now Now it's time on the Breaker.news podcast for Cascadia Calling. We look at news headlines around the Pacific Northwest. In the Oregonian, 17 new drug treatment beds coming to Portland. 2 days after a large building on the city's inner east side was put up for auction, Central City Concern bid on it with financial backing from all levels of government, on top of $3 million of its own funds. The Oregon Health Authority pitched in $6 million, Multnomah County $6.25 million, and the City of Portland $2 million. As untreated substance abuse and overdose deaths have soared in Oregon, the project represents a milestone in the region's effort to both prioritize behavioral health care and improve multi-agency collaboration. In the Seattle Times, Washington ferry system scraps timeline for resuming normal service. After several years of trying to predict when normal ferry service might return, Washington State Ferries is now acknowledging what most regular riders likely already suspected. Until new boats come online 4 to 5 years from now, normal service is not possible. That means routes between Seattle and Bremerton, Fauntleroy, Southworth and Vashon, and Port Townsend and Coupeville will each indefinitely operate with one fewer boat than they should. It also means other routes, such as Edmonds to Kingston, are likely to continue experiencing intermittent service reductions. In the Times Colonist, black bear chased out of den under Cowichan couple's deck. Crystal Weaver and Tyler Weichel knew something was up under their home along the banks of the Cowichan River. They had seen the bear fishing in the nearby Cowichan River, but didn't want it living under their home during hibernation, which can be up to 6 months. But early on December 28th, Weichel and Weaver crawled under the deck and found a black bear staring right back at them. That's Cascadia Calling on this edition of the Breaker.news podcast.
Don't matter what color you are, 'cause love will conquer hate, so you won't stand alone, you won't stand alone.
The virtual Nanaimo Bar, brought to you by Spruce Hill Contracting. Every week we end the Breaker.news podcast on a tasty note by awarding the goodness of a virtual Nanaimo Bar to people making a difference. A virtual version of the province's favorite dessert bar goes this week to scientists who are seeking a cure for Alzheimer's, people living with the disease, and their caregivers. It is Alzheimer's Awareness Month in British Columbia. You can nominate someone for a virtual Nanaimo Bar. Send me an email to bob@theBreaker.news. Spruce Hill Contracting, custom homes and renovations. Find more information at sprucehill.ca. That's it for the Breaker.news podcast for the week of January 7th, 2024. I'm Bob Mackin. Thanks for joining me. Did you know that on the 7th of January in 1999, the Senate trial for the impeachment of President Bill Clinton began? Remember this?
But I want to say one thing to the American people. I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. I never told anybody to lie, not a single time, never. These allegations are false, and I need to go back to work for the American people.
Now you know. Send me your feedback. Send me your story ideas to bob@theBreaker.news. Bookmark theBreaker.news. You can also find us at theBreaker.ca. Sign up for the free email newsletter and get updates to your inbox. Or follow The Breaker News on Twitter for news as it happens. And you can support The Breaker for as little as $2 a month. For more information, go to patreon.com/TheBreakerNews. That's patreon.com/TheBreakerNews. Until next week.